7-year-old girl calls 911 and says, "The bus driver did things to me again." What they found shocked everyone. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The morning sun cast long shadows across the quiet streets of Westfield, Illinois, a small town where neighbors still waved from their porches and children rode their bikes without fear. It was the kind of place where nothing ever really happened, until October 15th, when everything changed with a single phone call. Officer Matthew O'Connor sat at his desk in the small police station, sipping his second cup of coffee and reviewing routine patrol reports. At 32 years old, Matthew was still adjusting to small-town life after transferring from Chicago 6 months earlier. The move had been necessary. He wanted his 8-year-old daughter Katie to grow up somewhere safe, somewhere peaceful, during his custody weekends. The 911 dispatch phone rang at exactly 2:47 p.m. Matthew picked up on the second ring, expecting another call about Mrs. Henderson's escaped cat or a minor fender bender on Main Street. 911, what's your emergency? Matthew answered in his practiced, calm tone. What he heard next made his blood run cold. A small, trembling voice whispered through the receiver, "Please, please help me, the bus driver. He's doing wrong things again. I'm scared." Matthew immediately straightened in his chair. The voice belonged to a child, a little girl who couldn't be older than his own Katie, but there was something in her tone that hit him like a punch to the chest. It wasn't just fear. It was the sound of someone who had been carrying a terrible secret. "Sweetheart, can you tell me your name?" Matthew asked gently, switching to the soft voice he used with his daughter. "Where are you right now?" "My name is Emma," the little voice replied, barely audible. "Emma Louise. I jumped out of the emergency window. I had to get away. I'm hiding behind Mrs. Peterson's fence on Maple Street." Matthew's heart raced. A child jumping from a school bus emergency window? His parental instincts kicked into overdrive. "Emma, you're very brave for calling. Can you stay on the line with me? I'm coming to help you right now." "He said nobody would believe me," Emma whispered, her voice breaking. "He said grown-ups never listen to kids like me. But Grandma Dot said if something feels wrong, I should tell someone, even if they don't believe me the first time." Matthew was already grabbing his keys and radio. "Emma, your grandma is absolutely right. I believe you, and I'm going to help you. Can you see the yellow school bus from where you are?" "Yes," she whispered. "It's bus number 47. Mr. Harold is still inside, talking to someone from school. He looks normal, but he's not normal when we're alone." The words sent chills down Matthew's spine. As a father, he knew children didn't make up stories like this. There was a truth in Emma's voice that no adult could fake. "Emma, I need you to stay exactly where you are, okay? Don't go near the bus. I'm driving to you right now in my police car. You'll see the blue and red lights, but don't worry. You're not in trouble. You did exactly the right thing by calling." For a moment, there was silence on the line. Then Matthew heard something that made his hands tighten on the steering wheel. The distinct sound of a heavy door slamming shut, followed by footsteps on gravel. "Emma?" Matthew called into the radio. "Emma, are you still there?" A man's voice could be heard in the background, distant but growing closer. "Emma! Emma Louise, where did you go?" The little girl's voice returned, barely a whisper now. "He's looking for me. He sounds angry. I have to hide." "Emma, listen to me very carefully," Matthew said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Stay hidden, stay quiet. I'm 2 minutes away. Everything is going to be okay." But the line had gone dead. Matthew pressed harder on the accelerator, his mind racing with scenarios, each one worse than the last. In his 6 months in Westfield, he had responded to calls about lost pets, minor disputes, and the occasional teenage prank. Nothing had prepared him for this, a child in danger, a situation that felt all too familiar from his big city days. As he turned onto Maple Street, Matthew could see the distinctive yellow of school bus number 47 parked at the corner. Standing beside it was a middle-aged man in the standard uniform of a school bus driver, casually checking the vehicle's exterior while chatting with a woman holding a clipboard, probably a school supervisor doing routine checks. Everything looked completely normal, too normal. But somewhere nearby, a little girl named Emma Louise was hiding, scared and alone, trusting that the grown-up she had called would actually listen to her voice. Matthew parked his patrol car and stepped out, his trained eyes scanning the area. Behind Mrs. Peterson's white picket fence, he caught a glimpse of green fabric, a small dress, barely visible through the fence slats. And clutched against that green fabric was a worn teddy bear, held tight by small, frightened hands. The most heartbreaking part wasn't what Matthew could see. It was what he was about to discover about how many people had already failed to hear Emma's voice. Matthew approached Mrs. Peterson's fence with careful steps, his heart pounding as he spotted the small figure crouched behind the white pickets. There, pressed against the wooden slats, was 7-year-old Emma Louise, a tiny girl in a grass-stained green dress, her school backpack still strapped to her shoulders, clutching a well-worn teddy bear like her life depended on it. Her big brown eyes looked up at Matthew with a mixture of hope and terror. Tears had left clean tracks down her dusty cheeks, but what struck Matthew most was the determination in her small face. This wasn't a child throwing a tantrum. This was someone who had made an incredibly brave decision. "Emma," Matthew whispered softly, crouching down to her eye level. "I'm Officer Matthew. You called me, remember? You're safe now." Emma's lower lip trembled as she nodded. "You really came," she whispered back. "I wasn't sure. Grown-ups don't always come when kids ask for help." The simple statement hit Matthew like a physical blow. How many times had this little girl asked for help before? How many adults had dismissed her concerns? "Well, I'm here now," Matthew said gently, "and I always keep my promises to brave kids like you. Can you tell me what happened on the bus today?" Emma glanced nervously toward bus number 47, where Mr. Harold Winters was still chatting with the school supervisor, completely unaware that his world was about to change forever. Harold appeared to be in his late 50s, with graying hair and a friendly smile. He looked exactly like what central casting would order for a kind school bus driver, which made Emma's fear all the more chilling. He made me sit in the front seat again," Emma began, her voice barely audible. "He said it was because I was his special helper, but it didn't feel special. It felt scary." Matthew listened intently, noting how Emma's body language changed as she spoke, how she hunched her shoulders and held her teddy bear tighter. "When there were lots of kids on the bus, he acted normal," Emma continued. "But when it was just me and maybe 1 or 2 other kids left, he would start saying things that made my tummy feel sick. He would look at me in his big mirror and say things about how pretty I was, and how we had special secrets that I couldn't tell anyone." The protective father in Matthew wanted to march straight over to Harold and demand answers, but his training told him to stay calm and gather information. Emma needed him to be steady, not angry. "Emma, you are incredibly brave for telling me this," Matthew said softly. "Can you tell me what made today different? What made you decide to call for help?" Emma's eyes filled with fresh tears. "Today, after all the other kids got off, he stopped the bus early. He said he wanted to show me something special in the back of the bus, but something inside me screamed that it was wrong. Really, really wrong." She took a shaky breath before continuing. "Grandma Dot always tells me to trust my inside voice, the one that tells me when something doesn't feel right. So when he got up from his seat and started walking toward me with that weird smile, I ran to the emergency window and pushed it open. I jumped out and ran." Matthew felt a surge of admiration for this tiny girl's courage. At 7 years old, she had trusted her instincts and taken action to protect herself. But the thought of what might have happened if she hadn't been so brave made his stomach turn. "You did exactly the right thing, Emma," Matthew assured her. "Your grandma taught you well. That inside voice you listen to, that's very smart." Just then, Harold's voice carried across the street. "Excuse me, officer, but have you seen a little girl around here? One of my students seems to have wandered off. Emma Louise Miller. She's probably just playing hide and seek, but her grandmother will be worried." Matthew felt Emma stiffen beside him. The casual way Harold spoke about her, as if she were simply a mischievous child playing games, made Matthew's jaw clench. But what disturbed him most was how perfectly normal Harold sounded, how genuinely concerned he appeared to be. "Stay right here," Matthew whispered to Emma. "I'm going to talk to him, but I want you to know that you're safe. I believe every word you've told me." Matthew stood up and walked toward Harold, studying the man's body language carefully. Harold's smile was warm and grandfatherly, his concern appeared genuine, and his uniform was neat and professional. To anyone watching, he looked like exactly what he was supposed to be, a trusted adult whose job was to keep children safe. "Mr. Winters, I presume?" Matthew said, extending his hand. "I'm Officer O'Connor. I understand you're looking for Emma Louise?" "Yes, yes," Harold replied, shaking Matthew's hand with what seemed like genuine relief. "Thank goodness you're here. The little one must have gotten off at the wrong stop. She's been acting a bit imaginative lately. You know how children can be, always making up stories, seeing monsters where there aren't any." The words, "making up stories," sent a chill down Matthew's spine. How many times had Emma heard those exact words when she tried to tell adults what was happening? "Well, Mr. Winters," Matthew said carefully, "I'd like to hear more about Emma's imaginative stories. In fact, I think it would be best if we all sit down and have a conversation. You, me, Emma, and her grandmother. What do you say?" For just a split second, so brief that most people would have missed it, something flickered behind Harold's friendly eyes. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the look of someone realizing that their carefully constructed world might be about to crumble. But then the smile returned, bright and grandfatherly as ever. "Of course, officer," Harold said smoothly. "Though I'm sure this is all just a big misunderstanding. Emma has such an active imagination. Sometimes I think she gets confused about what's real and what's pretend." As Harold spoke, Matthew caught sight of Emma peeking through the fence slats, her small face filled with a mixture of fear and something else, relief. For the first time in who knows how long, an adult was actually listening to her. But as Matthew looked back at Harold's perfectly composed face, he realized that this was only the beginning. The hardest part wouldn't be believing Emma. It would be convincing everyone else in a town where Harold Winters had been the trusted bus driver for over 20 years. The real question was, how many other children had tried to tell their stories, only to be dismissed as having active imaginations? Matthew knelt back down beside Emma, his mind racing with questions, but his voice remained gentle and calm. "Emma, I need to ask you something important. Has anyone else noticed that you've been feeling scared or worried lately?" Emma nodded slowly, wiping her nose with the back of her small hand. "Grandma Dot noticed. She said I stopped singing in the mornings, and I used to always sing while getting ready for school. She asked me lots of times if something was wrong." "And what did you tell her?" Matthew asked softly. "At first, nothing," Emma admitted, looking down at her teddy bear. "Mr. Harold said that telling grown-ups about our special friendship would just make everyone sad and confused. He said grown-ups had too many worries already, and little girls who caused trouble for nice men like him would make their families very upset." Matthew felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his expression neutral. The manipulation was textbook, making a child feel responsible for protecting the adult who was supposed to protect them. "But Grandma Dot is different," Emma continued, a small smile crossing her face for the first time. "She makes the best chocolate chip cookies in the whole world, and she always has time to listen. Last week, when I had another bad dream about the bus, she sat on my bed and said something really important." "What did she say?" Matthew encouraged. Emma's voice grew stronger as she remembered her grandmother's words. "She said that brave little girls like me have voices that matter, and that no grown-up, no matter how nice they seem, should ever make a child feel scared or confused. She said if someone was making me uncomfortable, it wasn't my fault, and it wasn't my job to protect their feelings." Matthew felt a wave of gratitude toward this grandmother he hadn't even met yet. Dot Miller had given Emma something invaluable, permission to trust herself and speak up. "Your grandma sounds very wise," Matthew said. "So you finally told her what was happening?" "Last night," Emma nodded. "After another scary day on the bus, Mr. Harold had been asking me strange questions about whether I told anyone about our talks, and he seemed worried. I was scared that maybe he was going to do something even worse. Matthew's heart ached for this little girl who had been carrying such a heavy burden. And what did Grandma Dot say when you told her? Emma's eyes lit up with the memory. She didn't act shocked or upset. She just held me really tight and said she was proud of me for being so brave. Then she said we were going to make sure I was safe no matter what. She wanted to call the school right away, but I begged her to wait until today. Why did you want to wait? Matthew asked gently. Because I wanted to see if Mr. Harold would stop on his own. Maybe if I acted really normal, he would leave me alone and pick on someone else. Emma's voice trailed off as she realized what she had just said. But that would be bad too, wouldn't it? I don't want him to make any kid feel scared. The maturity in Emma's concern for other children was both heartwarming and heartbreaking. At 7 years old, she was already thinking about protecting others. You know what, Emma? Matthew said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. You are one of the bravest people I've ever met, and you're absolutely right. We need to make sure no other children have to feel scared. Just then, Matthew's radio crackled to life. Unit 12. We have Grandma Dot Miller on the phone. She's asking about her granddaughter Emma Louise. She sounds pretty worried. Emma's face brightened immediately. That's my grandma. She probably came home from her grocery shopping and found my note. You left a note? Matthew asked, impressed by this child's thoughtfulness. I didn't want her to worry if she came home and I wasn't there, Emma explained. I wrote, Dear Grandma Dot, I had to call the police about Mr. Harold like we talked about. I am safe. I love you. Emma. I put it on the kitchen table next to her coffee cup. Matthew couldn't help but smile. Even in her moment of crisis, Emma had thought to comfort her grandmother. But as he looked toward the school bus where Harold was still chatting casually with the supervisor, acting for all the world like a perfectly normal afternoon, Matthew realized they were facing a much bigger challenge than just one man's inappropriate behavior. They were up against a system that had trained children to doubt themselves and adults to dismiss their concerns. How many other Emma Louises were out there staying silent because they'd been told they were too imaginative or confused about what really happened? Matthew stood up and spoke into his radio. Dispatch, please tell Mrs. Miller that Emma is safe and with me. We're going to need her to come down to Maple Street, and we're also going to need someone from the school administration here as well. As he finished speaking, Matthew noticed Harold's head turn sharply in their direction. The bus driver had clearly heard the radio conversation, and for the first time, his carefully maintained composure seemed to crack just slightly. Emma noticed it too. She tugged on Matthew's uniform sleeve and whispered, Officer Matthew? Mr. Harold looks different now. He looks scared. Matthew glanced back at Harold, who was now making hasty excuses to the school supervisor, clearly preparing to leave. Emma, Matthew said quietly, I need you to stay right here behind this fence until your grandma arrives. Can you do that for me? Yes, sir, Emma replied, clutching her teddy bear tighter. But Officer Matthew, what if nobody believes me? What if they think I'm just a little girl making up stories? Matthew knelt down one more time and looked directly into Emma's worried eyes. Emma Louise Miller, I want you to remember something very important. Your voice matters. Your feelings matter. And sometimes it takes just one brave person speaking up to help a whole lot of other people find their courage too. What Matthew didn't yet know was that Emma's courage was about to uncover a truth that would shake the entire town of Westfield to its core. Within minutes, Matthew could see a small blue sedan speeding down Maple Street. Even from a distance, he could tell the driver was in a hurry. The car pulled up with a slight screech of brakes, and out stepped a woman in her early 70s with silver hair and determined eyes. Grandma Dot, Emma called out, emerging from behind the fence and running straight into her grandmother's arms. Dorothy Dot Miller was exactly what Matthew had imagined, a woman who radiated strength and love in equal measure. She wrapped Emma in a fierce hug, then looked her granddaughter over carefully, checking for any signs of harm. Are you okay, sweetheart? Dot asked, her voice steady despite the worry in her eyes. When I found your note, my heart nearly stopped. I'm okay, Grandma, Emma said, her voice muffled against Dot's shoulder. Officer Matthew believes me. He really believes me. Dot looked up at Matthew with gratitude shining in her eyes. Thank you, she said simply. You have no idea how much it means to hear that someone finally listened to her. Mrs. Miller, Matthew began, I need to ask you some questions about Emma's concerns regarding Mr. Winters. But first, I want you to know that I take every word Emma has said very seriously. Dot's expression darkened slightly. Mr. Winters, she repeated. You know, officer, I tried to talk to people about changes I noticed in Emma's behavior. For months, I've been watching my happy little granddaughter become quiet and withdrawn. She stopped singing, stopped being excited about school, started having nightmares. Who did you speak with? Matthew asked, pulling out his notepad. First, I called her teacher, Mrs. Martinez, Dot explained. She said Emma seemed fine in class and that sometimes children go through phases. Then I tried calling the school's main office, but they transferred me to an assistant who made me feel like a worried old woman seeing problems where none existed. Matthew felt a familiar frustration building. How many times had Emma's concerns been dismissed before they ever reached the right person? What about the school administration? Did you speak directly with Principal Thompson? Dot shook her head. I tried to make an appointment, but her secretary said the principal was very busy and that behavior concerns should be handled through proper channels. When I asked what those channels were, I got transferred to 3 different people, and none of them seemed to think a grandmother's concerns were worth investigating. Just then, an official-looking car pulled up. Westfield Elementary's principal, Rebecca Thompson, had arrived. She was a woman in her 50s with perfectly styled hair and a no-nonsense expression. She stepped out of her car and immediately approached the group, her eyes briefly scanning over Emma before focusing on Matthew. Officer O'Connor, I understand there's been some sort of misunderstanding involving one of our students and Mr. Winters. Principal Thompson's tone suggested she already considered this a minor issue that would be quickly resolved. Principal Thompson, Matthew replied formally, I'd like to discuss some concerns that have been raised about Mr. Winters' interactions with students on his bus route. The principal's expression remained politely skeptical. I see. Well, I can assure you that Harold Winters has been with our district for over 20 years. He's beloved by the children and trusted by families throughout our community. We've never had a single formal complaint about his conduct. Never? Matthew asked pointedly, glancing at Dot Miller. Well, Principal Thompson said, waving her hand dismissively, we occasionally get calls from parents or grandparents who are concerned about normal interactions. But Harold has always been exemplary. He remembers every child's name, asks about their families, takes a personal interest in their well-being. That's exactly what we want in our transportation staff. Matthew felt Emma squeeze closer to her grandmother's side. The very qualities that Principal Thompson was praising, remembering names, taking personal interest, asking about families, were exactly the tools that would make Harold effective at targeting vulnerable children. Principal Thompson, I'd like to request access to any previous reports or concerns that have been filed regarding Mr. Winters, even informal ones. The principal's smile became strained. Officer O'Connor, I'm sure you understand that we can't simply hand over personnel files based on a child's imagination. Emma is a sweet girl, but children sometimes misinterpret adult kindness or attention. Misinterpret? Dot's voice cut through the air like a blade. My granddaughter jumped out of a bus window because she was terrified. Does that sound like misinterpretation to you? Principal Thompson's expression softened into what she probably thought was maternal understanding. Mrs. Miller, I know you love Emma very much, and it's natural for grandparents to be protective. But sometimes children create dramatic stories for attention, especially when they're dealing with changes at home. Matthew watched Emma's face crumble slightly at those words. Once again, an adult was suggesting that her truth wasn't real. Principal Thompson, Matthew said firmly, I'd also like to examine the bus security cameras from the past few weeks. Oh, the principal replied, looking genuinely apologetic. I'm afraid those cameras have been having technical difficulties for several months now. We've been meaning to get them repaired, but budget constraints, you understand. Of course they were broken, Matthew thought grimly. How convenient. However, Principal Thompson continued brightly, I'd be happy to arrange a meeting with Mr. Winters so you can speak with him directly. I'm sure once you hear his side of the story, you'll realize this is all just a big misunderstanding. As if summoned by her words, Harold Winters approached the group. His earlier nervousness had been replaced by his familiar grandfatherly demeanor, complete with a concerned smile. Principal Thompson, I heard there was some concern about little Emma, he said, his voice filled with what sounded like genuine worry. I do hope she's all right. She seemed upset when she got off the bus today. I was worried she might be coming down with something. Matthew noticed how Harold's story had already changed. Earlier, he'd said Emma had wandered off and that he was looking for her. Now he was claiming she had gotten off the bus normally. But what disturbed Matthew most was watching Emma's reaction. The moment Harold spoke, she pressed herself against her grandmother's side and whispered, "That's not what happened. That's not what happened at all." For the first time since this whole situation began, Matthew realized they weren't just dealing with one man's inappropriate behavior. They were facing something much larger, a system that protected adults and dismissed children, where broken cameras were seen as budget problems rather than safety failures, and where a child's courage to speak up was labeled as imagination. The question was, how many other children had tried to tell their stories, only to be met with the same dismissive responses Emma was hearing right now? After the tense confrontation with Principal Thompson and Harold, Matthew decided it was time to hear the full story from someone who had been watching and listening, really listening, to Emma's concerns. He followed Dot Miller and Emma back to their cozy house on Elm Street, a small blue cottage with a garden full of sunflowers and a porch swing that looked well-loved. Inside, the house smelled like vanilla and cinnamon, and every surface seemed to hold a photo of Emma at different ages, gap-toothed smiles, birthday parties, school pictures. This was clearly a home filled with love. "Officer Matthew, would you like some coffee?" Dot asked, automatically moving toward the kitchen. "I always think better with a warm cup in my hands." "That would be nice, thank you," Matthew replied, settling into a comfortable armchair while Emma curled up on the couch with her teddy bear. As Dot prepared the coffee, Matthew noticed how naturally she included Emma in their conversation, never speaking over her or treating her like she wasn't there. This was a grandmother who truly saw her granddaughter as a whole person whose thoughts and feelings mattered. "Mrs. Miller," Matthew began gently, "can you walk me through the changes you noticed in Emma over the past few months?" Dot's hands paused as she poured the coffee. "It started small," she said, her voice heavy with the weight of unheeded warnings. "Emma has always been my little songbird, humming while she brushed her teeth, making up silly songs about her breakfast. But sometime around the beginning of the school year, the singing stopped." She handed Matthew his coffee and sat down across from him. Then came the nightmares. Emma would wake up crying, saying she had bad dreams about being trapped in small spaces. When I asked her about it, she would just shake her head and say she couldn't remember. "Did you notice anything else?" Matthew asked, watching Emma nod along with her grandmother's words. "Her appetite changed," Dot continued. "This child used to love my pancakes on Sunday mornings, but she started picking at her food. And the questions that broke my heart." Dot's voice grew softer. "She asked me things like, 'Grandma, what if someone says they're being nice to you, but it doesn't feel nice?' And, 'Is it okay to hurt a grown-up's feelings if they're making you uncomfortable?'" Matthew felt his chest tighten. Those were exactly the kinds of questions a child would ask when someone was manipulating them into staying silent. "What did you tell her?" he asked. "I told her that her feelings were always valid, and that no adult should ever make a child feel confused or scared about what nice means," Dot replied firmly. "I said that protecting herself was more important than protecting anyone else's feelings, even grown-ups." Emma looked up from her teddy bear. "That's when I knew I could trust Grandma Dot with the truth," she said quietly. "Because she didn't tell me I was being silly or imagining things." Dot's eyes filled with tears. "But when I tried to get help from the school system, I felt like I was speaking a foreign language. Every person I talked to had a reason why my concerns weren't worth investigating." "Can you tell me more about those conversations?" Matthew asked, pulling out his notepad. The first person I spoke with was the school secretary, Dot began, counting on her fingers. She told me that transportation issues needed to go through the district office. So I called the district office, and they told me that behavioral concerns should be reported to the school counselor. The school counselor said that without specific incidents, she couldn't investigate vague feelings. Matthew shook his head in frustration. What about when you mentioned specific changes in Emma's behavior? That's when it got worse, Dot said, her voice growing tight with remembered anger. I finally got through to someone at the county's child services office. I explained about the nightmares, the lost appetite, the fear of going to school. You know what she said to me? Dot stood up and walked to the window, looking out at her sunflower garden. She said, "Don't create alarm, Mrs. Miller. Children go through phases and sometimes grandparents can be overly protective. We don't want to ruin a good man's reputation based on a child's imagination." The words hung in the air like a slap. Matthew could see how they had wounded this strong woman who was only trying to protect her granddaughter. That phone call made me feel invisible, Dot continued, turning back to face Matthew. Like my 72 years of experience watching children, raising children and loving children, meant nothing because I was just a grandmother. Emma got up from the couch and wrapped her arms around her grandmother's waist. But you're not just anything, Grandma. You're the smartest person I know. Dot hugged Emma tightly and looked at Matthew with determination burning in her eyes. After that call, I decided to trust my granddaughter more than I trusted the system. I told Emma that we were going to handle this ourselves, and that if something scary happened again, she should find a way to call for help immediately. And that's exactly what she did, Matthew said with admiration. What I don't understand, Dot continued, is how many other families have been through this same runaround. How many other grandmothers have been made to feel like worried old ladies whose concerns don't matter. Matthew was about to respond when Emma spoke up from her grandmother's arms. Grandma Dot, I think maybe Tommy Chen's grandma might know what we're talking about. Both adults turned to look at her. What do you mean, sweetheart? Dot asked. Mrs. Chen came over last week when you were at the grocery store, remember? She seemed really worried about Tommy. She said he's been acting different since he started riding Mr. Harold's bus route. She asked if I'd noticed anything strange about the bus rides. Emma looked between Matthew and her grandmother. I wanted to tell her everything, but I was still too scared. But maybe now that Officer Matthew believes us, Mrs. Chen would want to know that she's not the only one who's worried. Matthew felt a chill run down his spine. If Emma was right, then Harold's inappropriate behavior wasn't limited to just one child. And if Mrs. Chen had noticed changes in her grandson Tommy, how many other families were out there, struggling with the same concerns and getting the same dismissive responses? Mrs. Miller, Matthew said slowly, I think it's time we paid a visit to your neighbor, because if Emma is right, then this situation is much bigger than any of us realized. As they prepared to walk next door, Matthew couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to open a door that would reveal a truth that had been hiding in plain sight for far too long. The walk to Mrs. Chen's house next door felt both too short and too long. Matthew could sense the weight of what they might discover, while Emma held tightly to her grandmother's hand, her courage growing with each step. Mrs. Chen, a gentle woman in her 60s, answered the door with surprise and immediate concern when she saw the police officer. But when Dot explained why they were there, her expression shifted to something Matthew recognized. Relief mixed with fear. Please, come in, Mrs. Chen said quietly. Tommy is at his friend's house, but, yes, I've been very worried about him. In her living room, surrounded by photos of a smiling 6-year-old boy, Mrs. Chen shared a story that made Matthew's heart sink. Tommy had started having trouble sleeping, had become clingy and fearful, and had begun asking strange questions about secrets that grown-ups keep. When I called the school, Mrs. Chen said, her voice barely above a whisper, they made me feel like I was overreacting. They said Mr. Winters was like a grandfather to the children, and that sometimes kids go through difficult phases. Matthew took careful notes as Mrs. Chen described her son's changes, the same pattern he'd heard from Dot Miller. As they spoke, Emma sat quietly beside her grandmother, occasionally nodding when Mrs. Chen mentioned something familiar. "Mrs. Chen," Matthew said gently, "would you be willing to have Tommy speak with a child psychologist, someone trained to help kids talk about things that might be troubling them?" Mrs. Chen's eyes filled with tears. "You mean, you believe that something really is wrong, that I'm not just being an overprotective grandmother?" "You're being exactly what every child deserves," Dot replied firmly. "A grandmother who pays attention and cares enough to ask questions." As they left Mrs. Chen's house, Matthew realized they needed professional help. But first, he wanted to dig deeper into Harold's history. What he discovered in the old school files that evening would change everything. Buried in a dusty filing cabinet, Matthew found records of 3 other informal complaints about Harold from previous years, all dismissed as misunderstandings or children being overly sensitive. The pattern was clear. Harold targeted quiet, vulnerable children from families that the system was less likely to believe. Most disturbing of all, Matthew discovered that Harold had specifically requested to drive routes that served neighborhoods with many single-parent families and elderly caregivers. Someone higher up had approved these requests without question. That night, Matthew sat in his apartment staring at the case files spread across his kitchen table. His own daughter Katie's photo smiled at him from the refrigerator, and he found himself thinking about all the ways the system had failed Emma and Tommy. His phone rang at 11 p.m. It was his ex-wife Sarah calling from Chicago. "Matt, Katie had a nightmare tonight. She kept asking if her bus driver at school was nice like he's supposed to be." I didn't know what she meant, but something in her voice reminded me of how I felt when someone I trusted made me uncomfortable as a child. Matthew's blood ran cold. "Sarah, has Katie said anything specific about her bus rides?" "Not directly, but she's been asking weird questions lately, like whether it's okay for adults to ask kids to keep secrets, or whether she should tell me if someone makes her feel funny inside." The conversation lasted an hour. By the end, Matthew had convinced Sarah to have Katie evaluated by a child psychologist, and Sarah had agreed to keep Katie home from school until they knew more. As Matthew hung up the phone, he realized the true scope of what they were dealing with. This wasn't just about one man in one small town. It was about a culture that protected adults' reputations over children's safety. He thought about Emma's courage, Dot's persistence, Mrs. Chen's worry, and now his own daughter's potential vulnerability. How many children were suffering in silence because adults found it easier to dismiss their concerns than investigate them. Matthew made a decision that night. Even if it cost him his job, he was going to make sure Emma's voice was heard. But first, he needed help from someone who understood how to talk to children about difficult topics. The weight of responsibility felt crushing, but Emma's brave example gave him strength. If a 7-year-old could find the courage to jump out of a bus window and call for help, then he could find the courage to challenge a system that had failed her. The next morning, Matthew remembered the plaque he'd seen at Westfield Elementary. Something about Susan Walsh and her 30 years of service. He tracked down her address and found himself standing on the porch of a cozy house filled with the sound of wind chimes. Susan Walsh, a woman in her late 60s with kind eyes and gray hair, invited him in without hesitation. Her living room walls were covered with drawings from children, thank you notes from families, and certificates of appreciation. "I've been expecting someone like you," Susan said as she poured him tea. "I heard through the grapevine that Emma Miller finally found an adult who would listen to her." Matthew nearly choked on his tea. "You knew about Emma's situation?" Susan's expression grew sad. "I suspected. In my 30 years as a school psychologist, you develop an instinct for these things. There were signs, subtle changes in certain children's behavior. Always the same children who rode Harold's route." She walked to a filing cabinet and pulled out a thick folder. 15 years ago, I documented my concerns about Harold Winters. I submitted a detailed report to the administration recommending further investigation." "What happened to the report?" Matthew asked, though he suspected he already knew. "It disappeared," Susan said simply. "Principal Thompson was new then, and when I asked about it, she said there was no record of such a report ever being filed. I was told that making unfounded accusations could result in my early retirement. Susan's hands trembled slightly as she continued. I've regretted staying silent for 15 years. When I heard about Emma's brave call to 911, I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. Together, they developed a plan. Susan would use her expertise to interview the children who had been identified as potential victims, while Matthew continued his investigation into the institutional failures that had allowed Harold to continue his behavior unchecked. "Susan," Matthew said as he prepared to leave, "why didn't you speak up again after you retired?" She smiled sadly. "Because I thought it was too late. I thought the children who might have been affected were all grown up now. I didn't realize that Harold was still targeting new children." As Matthew walked back to his car, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Emma's courage was creating ripples that were awakening other adults who had long carried the burden of unspoken concerns. Over the next week, Susan Walsh's living room became an unofficial headquarters for what Dot Miller had started calling their protection network. The group now included Matthew, Susan, Dot, Mrs. Chen, and 3 other families who had come forward after word spread quietly through the community. Each family's story was heartbreakingly similar: changes in their children's behavior, concerns dismissed by school officials, and the feeling that they were fighting an invisible enemy that everyone else pretended didn't exist. Susan had developed a gentle, play-based approach to talking with the children. Using dolls, drawings, and storytelling, she helped them express their feelings without traumatizing them further. The children didn't need to relive specific incidents. They just needed adults to acknowledge that their feelings of discomfort and fear were valid. Emma had become something of a leader among the children. Her courage in speaking up had given others permission to share their own stories. Tommy Chen, who had been silent and withdrawn for months, began to smile again when he realized he wasn't alone. "The beautiful thing," Susan told Matthew one afternoon as they watched the children play in Dot's backyard, "is how resilient kids are when they feel supported. Emma isn't just healing, she's helping other children heal too." Matthew was documenting everything carefully, building a case that would be impossible for anyone to dismiss. But what struck him most was watching Dot Miller coordinate this network of families with the efficiency of a seasoned general. "You know," Dot said to Matthew as she organized snacks for the children, "I spent months feeling like nobody would listen to an old grandmother. Turns out, there were a lot of us old grandmothers who just needed to find each other." The network had uncovered something crucial. Harold had a pattern of requesting specific routes and showing unusual interest in children from single-parent households or those being raised by grandparents. It wasn't random, it was calculated. But as their evidence grew stronger, so did the resistance from the school administration. Principal Thompson had begun making phone calls to parents, suggesting that outside agitators were trying to create problems where none existed. The fight was just beginning. The breakthrough came when Susan suggested searching Harold's bus more thoroughly. With proper warrants and supervision, they discovered Harold's treasure box, a small container hidden under his seat, containing little trinkets he had given to children over the years. Each item told a story. A hair ribbon that belonged to a girl who had graduated 3 years ago, a small toy car from a boy who was now in middle school, and most chilling of all, a recent photo of Emma that she had never given to Harold. "He took this from my backpack," Emma told Matthew, her voice steady despite the revelation. "I was wondering where it went. It was my school picture that I was going to give to Grandma Dot." The physical evidence was damning, but what struck Matthew most was how the children reacted when they saw their missing items. Instead of being traumatized, they seemed relieved. Finally, here was proof that their memories were real, that they hadn't imagined the uncomfortable situations. "My bracelet," 6-year-old Lily Rodriguez exclaimed when she saw a small friendship bracelet in the box. "He said he was keeping it safe for me, but he never gave it back." Each recovered item represented a violation of trust, a boundary crossed, a child's personal belonging taken without permission. But more than that, each item represented a child who had been too scared or confused to tell anyone what was happening. When Harold was confronted with the evidence, his carefully maintained facade finally cracked. Instead of the grandfatherly figure he had presented for 20 years, Matthew saw someone calculating and manipulative. "Those children gave me those things," Harold insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. "They wanted me to have them as gifts. I was being kind, accepting their offerings." Principal Thompson, who had defended Harold so vigorously, stood silent as she witnessed the evidence. For the first time since this investigation began, she seemed to truly grasp the magnitude of what had been happening under her watch. But Harold's final act of desperation was yet to come. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Matthew discovered that Harold's connections to the community ran deeper than anyone had realized. Harold's wife, Margaret Winters, worked in the school district's administrative office. She was the very person who processed complaints about transportation issues. Even more shocking, Harold's brother-in-law served on the school board and had been instrumental in Harold's repeated route assignments and his protection from previous complaints. "It's not a conspiracy," Susan explained to the group gathered in Dot's living room. "It's just what happens in small communities where everyone knows everyone. People protect their own, even when protecting them means failing to protect children." Matthew felt the weight of systemic failure pressing down on him. This wasn't just about one bad actor. It was about a network of relationships that had inadvertently created a shield around Harold's behavior. Captain Richards called Matthew into his office that afternoon with unwelcome news. "The school board is pressuring the mayor, and the mayor is pressuring me," Richards said with obvious discomfort. "They want to know why we're harassing a longtime school employee based on what they're calling children's stories." "Captain, we have physical evidence now," Matthew protested. "The items in Harold's possession, the pattern of behavior—" I know," Richards interrupted. "And personally, I think you're doing the right thing. But politically, Matt, they're threatening to transfer you back to Chicago if you don't ease up on this investigation." Matthew felt his world tilting. The system that was supposed to protect children was now threatening him for trying to do exactly that. That evening, Matthew sat on his apartment balcony and called his daughter Katie. He needed to hear her voice, to remind himself why this fight was so important. "Daddy," Katie said, "are you okay? You sound sad." "I'm just thinking about how important it is for kids to know they can always tell the truth to grown-ups they trust," Matthew said carefully. "Even if the truth might make some people upset?" Katie asked. "Especially then, sweetheart. Sometimes the most important truths are the hardest ones to tell." After hanging up, Matthew made a decision. Even if it cost him his career, he wasn't going to let Emma's courage be wasted. Some things were more important than job security. As he was about to go inside, his phone rang. It was Emma's voice, small and frightened in the darkness. "Officer Matthew, Harold came to our house tonight. He told Grandma Dot that he was just stopping by to apologize for any misunderstandings, but his eyes looked angry. He kept staring at me and saying that sometimes little girls who tell stories end up making their whole families very sad." Matthew's blood ran cold. Harold was escalating, and now he was directly threatening Emma and her family. The next morning brought the crushing blow Matthew had been dreading. Captain Richards called him into his office with papers in hand, a transfer order back to Chicago, effective immediately. "I'm sorry, Matt," Richards said, his face etched with genuine regret. "The pressure from above. I fought for you, but they made it clear that continuing this investigation is not in the community's best interests." Matthew felt like someone had punched him in the chest. Richards had been like a father figure to him, someone he respected and trusted. Now that same person was essentially choosing the comfort of the community over the safety of children. "Captain, you know this is wrong," Matthew said, his voice breaking slightly. "Those kids are counting on us." Richard's hand shook as he slid the transfer papers across his desk. "I know it's wrong. Hell, I have grandchildren myself. But the mayor made it clear, if I don't transfer you, they'll find a way to remove me too. And then who'll be left to help those kids?" Matthew stared at the papers, feeling the weight of institutional betrayal crushing down on him. This was exactly what Harold had counted on, that the system would protect itself rather than protect children. That night, Matthew sat alone in his apartment, staring at the phone. He felt utterly defeated, questioning everything he'd ever believed about justice and protection. Around midnight, he found himself calling his daughter Katie in Chicago. "Daddy," Katie's sleepy voice answered. "It's really late. Are you okay?" Matthew tried to keep his voice steady, but emotion leaked through anyway. "Katie, sweetheart, I just want you to know that I love you more than anything in the world. And no matter what happens, if anyone ever makes you feel uncomfortable or scared, you can always, always tell me, okay? I know, Daddy. You tell me that all the time." Katie paused. "Daddy, are you crying?" "Just a little, baby girl. Sometimes grown-ups cry when they're worried about keeping kids safe. Is this about that little girl you told me about? The brave one who called for help?" Matthew's heart nearly broke. Even his 8-year-old daughter understood what the adults in Westfield seemed to miss. Yes, it's about her. And kids like her. "Well," Katie said with the simple wisdom of childhood, "maybe if the grown-ups won't listen, you need to find different grown-ups. The kind who remember what it feels like to be a scared kid." After hanging up, Matthew wiped his eyes and realized his daughter was right. If the system wouldn't protect Emma and the other children, then maybe it was time to go outside the system. His phone rang at exactly midnight. It was Emma, her voice barely a whisper. "Officer Matthew, Harold came back tonight. He stood outside our house for a long time, just watching our windows. Grandma Dot called 911, but they said since he was on a public street, he wasn't breaking any laws. He kept smiling and waving at me through my bedroom window. It was the scariest smile I've ever seen." Matthew's devastation transformed instantly into fierce determination. Transfer or no transfer, he wasn't abandoning these children. Not now, not ever. Matthew's world changed with a single phone call at 7 a.m. Emma's panicked voice came through his cell phone. "Officer Matthew, Harold is leaving town today. I heard him talking to someone at the gas station yesterday. He said he got a special transfer to another school district 3 counties away, and that this whole mess would blow over once the troublemakers moved on." Matthew's heart raced as he grabbed his keys despite his official suspension. If Harold left Westfield, he would simply find new victims in a new town, and all of Emma's courage would have been for nothing. "Emma, where are you right now?" Matthew asked, his mind already racing with possibilities. "At the library with Grandma Dot and Mrs. Chen. We're supposed to meet Susan here in 10 minutes, but, Officer Matthew, what if he hurts more kids in his new town? What if nobody believes them either? What if they don't have someone like you to listen?" The weight of that possibility crushed Matthew's chest. He had less than 12 hours to prevent Harold from disappearing into another community where his 20-year reputation would precede him and protect him once again. Matthew called Susan Walsh immediately. "Susan, we need to contact Maria Santos at Channel 7 News. If the local system won't listen to us, maybe the public will. We need to go bigger than Westfield." Within 3 hours, investigative journalist Maria Santos was sitting in Dot Miller's living room, surrounded by the families who had become Emma's protection network. Maria had built her career on exposing institutional failures that hurt children, and she immediately recognized the significance of what was happening in Westfield. "This isn't just about one inappropriate man," Maria told the group, her recorder carefully placed where everyone could see it. "This is about how systems fail children, how communities can unconsciously protect the wrong people, and how brave families like yours can change everything. Emma, your courage to speak up is going to help children you'll never even meet in places you'll never even visit." Emma, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside her grandmother, looked older than her 7 years. Her voice was steady as she replied, "I just want to make sure that if other kids try to tell grown-ups they're scared, somebody will believe them the first time, not the 10th time." Maria spent the afternoon interviewing each family, carefully and respectfully documenting their experiences without sensationalizing their pain. She also spoke extensively with Susan Walsh about the institutional barriers and the bureaucratic maze that had allowed Harold's behavior to continue unchecked for years. But the most powerful moment came when Maria asked Emma what she wanted other children watching the news to know. Emma thought for a long moment, then looked directly into the camera with the serious expression of someone much older. "If a grown-up is making you feel scared or confused inside your tummy, And they tell you it's a special secret between just you two. That's not a good secret. Good secrets are like surprise birthday parties that make everyone happy later. Bad secrets make your tummy hurt and make you want to hide. She paused, gathering her thoughts with the careful consideration that had impressed every adult she'd met. And if the first grown-up you tell doesn't believe you, keep telling until you find one who does. There are good grown-ups who will listen and help. You just have to keep looking for them, like I kept looking until I found Officer Matthew. Don't give up on finding your grown-up who listens. As Maria prepared to leave for the editing room, Matthew felt something he hadn't experienced in days: hope. Emma's voice was finally going to be heard beyond the borders of their small town, reaching families who might be struggling with the same confusion and fear. But at 6 p.m., just 2 hours before the evening news, Harold made one final, desperate attempt to control the narrative. He appeared at Dot Miller's front door with a small, wrapped box, his familiar grandfatherly smile in place despite the chaos swirling around him. "I just wanted to bring Emma a little going-away gift," he said to Dot, who had answered the door with Emma hiding behind her legs, "to show there are no hard feelings about this little misunderstanding." For a moment, the old Harold magic almost worked. His voice was kind, his manner gentle, his concern seemingly genuine. But Emma, strengthened by weeks of being believed and supported, stepped out from behind her grandmother. "No, thank you, Mr. Harold," she said clearly, her small voice carrying remarkable strength. "I don't want any gifts from you. And this isn't a misunderstanding. I know exactly what happened, and so do you." Harold's mask slipped for just an instant, revealing something cold and calculating beneath. But Emma didn't flinch. "I think you should go now," she continued. "And I think you should get help so you don't make other kids feel scared like you made me feel." As Harold walked away, Dot placed her hand on Emma's shoulder. "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart. You just showed him that his power over you is completely gone." The evening news was about to change everything for Harold Winters, and for countless other children whose voices had been waiting to be heard. That evening at 6 p.m., Maria Santos's investigative report aired on Channel 7 News across 3 states. The story, titled, "When Children's Voices Go Unheard, A Small Town's Big Lesson," sent shockwaves through communities far beyond Westfield. The carefully crafted report presented the family's experiences with respect and dignity, highlighting the systemic failures that had allowed Harold's inappropriate behavior to continue for years. Maria had also uncovered records from Harold's previous school districts, revealing a troubling pattern of quiet transfers and buried complaints that went back over 2 decades. But the heart of the broadcast was Emma's interview. Sitting beside her grandmother in Dot's sunlit living room, speaking with a clarity and wisdom that moved viewers to tears, Emma's words resonated across the region. "Sometimes grown-ups forget that kids have really good instincts too," Emma said to the camera, her brown eyes serious but hopeful. "We know when something doesn't feel right in our hearts. We just need grown-ups who remember how to listen with their hearts too." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within the first hour, the Channel 7 newsroom received over 200 phone calls from families, sharing similar stories of dismissed concerns and children who had tried to speak up but weren't believed. The state education department announced an emergency investigation. Most importantly, the school board called an emergency public hearing for the following evening. The Westfield Community Center had never seen a crowd like the one that gathered Thursday night. Nearly 400 people packed into the small auditorium, with local news crews from 5 stations broadcasting live. Emma sat in the front row between Dot and Matthew, wearing her favorite green dress and clutching her teddy bear with quiet confidence. The turning point came when Susan Walsh approached the microphone. The packed auditorium fell completely silent. 15 years ago, I filed a detailed report about Harold Winters, documenting concerning patterns in his interactions with children, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the room. That report disappeared from the files. When I asked about it, I was told that making unfounded accusations could end my career. The crowd's murmur grew louder as Susan continued. The most heartbreaking part isn't that one man behaved inappropriately with children. It's that our system made it easier to silence concerns than investigate them. We created a culture where protecting an adult's reputation became more important than protecting children's safety. The applause lasted nearly 3 minutes. When it died down, Dot Miller stood up. At 72 years old, she walked to the microphone with newfound strength. "For months, I felt invisible in this community," she said, her voice strong and clear. "People made me feel like a paranoid old grandmother whose concerns didn't matter. But my granddaughter taught me that courage isn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It's about being the most persistent voice for what's right." The school board voted unanimously to accept Harold's immediate resignation and implement comprehensive new safety protocols. But the most powerful moment came at the very end. Emma walked to the microphone, which had to be lowered to its minimum height. "I want to say thank you to all the grown-ups who learned how to listen to kids," she said, her small voice filling the auditorium. "But mostly, I want to tell other kids watching this that your voices matter more than you know. If something doesn't feel right, keep telling grown-ups until someone believes you." She looked out at the sea of faces. There are good grown-ups everywhere who want to help and protect kids. Sometimes you just have to help them remember how to hear you. Don't give up. Your voice is important, and you deserve to be safe and happy. As Emma walked back to her seat, the entire auditorium rose in a standing ovation that lasted over 5 minutes. What filled the room was something powerful, the sound of a community that had finally learned how to listen. 6 months later, Matthew stood in the parking lot of Westfield Elementary on a crisp spring morning, watching children climb aboard school buses with laughter instead of fear. He had been promoted to head a new regional task force on child protection, and today marked the implementation of the Emma Protocol, a system ensuring children's voices would never again go unheard. Each bus now featured working cameras with direct feeds to the school and district office, plus communication systems allowing children to report concerns immediately. Most importantly, any concern raised by a child, parent, or guardian would be investigated within 24 hours by an independent team. Emma bounded toward him across the parking lot, her backpack bouncing and her smile radiant. At 8 years old, she had become a local hero, featured in a children's book about courage and invited to speak at schools across the state. "Officer Matthew," she called out, wrapping him in a fierce hug. "Guess what? Tommy Chen is teaching kindergartners about good feelings and uncomfortable feelings during recess, and Mrs. Rodriguez asked me to help her talk to her nephew about trusting his instincts." Dot Miller approached them, now wearing a pin reading school board chairwoman. Her voice had become one of the most respected in the district, and her advocacy work had led to policy changes being studied by school systems across the country. "Matthew," Dot said warmly, "I still can't believe how much has changed. 6 months ago, I felt like no one would listen to a concerned grandmother. Now I'm helping other families navigate a system worth navigating." Susan Walsh had come out of retirement to lead the new child advocacy and protection program, with training sessions now mandatory throughout the region. The culture of dismissing children's concerns was being replaced with active listening and immediate response. As for Harold, he had accepted a plea agreement and was receiving professional counseling. More importantly, his case had triggered investigations at his previous school districts, giving other families the answers and closure they deserved. The most remarkable change was visible in the children themselves. Emma had organized a courage club at school, where kids could practice speaking up about anything that made them uncomfortable. The club's motto, written in Emma's careful handwriting, hung in the main hallway. "Big voices or little voices, brave voices or scared voices, all voices matter here." As Matthew prepared to leave, he watched Emma walk toward her bus with confidence. Next to the door, a colorful sticker proclaimed, "Your voice matters here. Speak up, speak out, stay safe." Emma paused before stepping up, placed her small hand on the sticker in her daily ritual of strength, then turned to wave at Matthew. She climbed aboard with her head high, her teddy bear tucked safely in her backpack, no longer a symbol of fear, but a reminder of the journey from silence to strength, from being unheard to becoming a voice for change. Matthew's phone buzzed with a text from his daughter Katie in Chicago. "Dad, my friend Sarah finally told her mom about something weird at school after I shared Emma's story. Everything's okay now and Sarah feels so much braver. Thank you for teaching me that kids' voices matter just as much as grown-up voices." As Matthew drove away, he reflected on how one small, brave voice had created ripples of change still spreading across communities he would never meet. Emma's courage hadn't just changed her own life. It had reminded an entire region that protecting children meant, first and foremost, believing them and listening with open hearts. The last thing Matthew saw in his rearview mirror was Emma's school bus pulling away, carrying a new generation of children who knew their voices mattered, their feelings were valid, and there would always be caring adults committed to hearing them. Sometimes the smallest voices carry the most powerful truths, and sometimes it takes just one person brave enough to speak up to remind everyone else how to listen, believe, and protect what matters most.